is the prominent expert in non-proliferation and disarmament issues, and with huge experience working in IAEA and other institutions. Mr. Tariq Rauf, thanks for joining us today. So the topic of our today's discussion is the first session of the Preparatory Committee for the 2026 Review Conference of the parties to the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which was held from 31st of July till 11th of August in Vienna. So, as I understand, you actively participated in it. So, could you just start with your overall impression of?
So, thank you, and I'm glad that the Peace Center is doing a review of how the NPT PrepCom, the first session here in Vienna, worked out. So, there were actually two meetings of the NPT. From 24th to 28th of August was the working group on strengthening the review process for the NPT, and from 31 July to 11 August was the PrepCom. So let me just correct myself. So the working group was from the 24th to the 28th of July.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So these were two meetings back to back. So starting, I think, first with the working group. As you know, the decision was taken in the very last session of the 10th NPT Review Conference in New York on the 26th of August. As the review conference was heading towards failure, the state parties were not able to adopt the final document on the review conference in August last year. The president of the conference, Ambassador Gustavos Lavanen, he gavelled through a decision on strengthening the NPT review process. Most of the operational paragraphs in that decision to strengthen the NPT review process were taken from a paper submitted by the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Initiative Group of about 10, 12 countries. So that meeting took place, and the chair was the Ambassador Jarmo Viinanen of Finland. So he chaired both the working group on the review process, and he also chaired the first session of the PrepCom here in Vienna. Interesting, there were about 14, 15 different proposals on strengthening the NPT review process. And for the first, I would say 3.5 or 4 days of the working group, the discussion was quite professional. It remained on topic. There wasn't much scoring of cheap political points, given the current situation of tensions between United States, China, and Russia, and so on. But then in the end, they were not able to agree on anything. Some of the proposals on the table actually really didn't need a working group. Some of them are common sense, which were already on the table before. That, if possible, we could appoint the chairs of the 3 sessions of the Preparatory Committee, which are held before a review conference. So the first session is chaired by the Western Group. The second session is chaired by the Eastern Group. The third session of the PrepCom is chaired by the non-aligned movement countries. And also the presidency of the review conference is also from the NAM, or non-aligned. And that is because you have 110 or 120 countries that are members of NAM, and therefore they get the presidency of the review conference. So I think at some point the proposals got a little bit too ambitious, and they got into micromanagement.
Mm-hmm.
So they said, okay, a statement by state should only be for 3 minutes. A statement by a group, like, for example, for the European Union or the non-aligned or the Arab group, should be for 8 minutes. So in practice, that is a good suggestion. But then after the group statement, the members of the groups also make statements. Mm-hmm. So you're basically duplicating and you're defeating the purpose of time management. So that was one problem. Other problem was on participation of NGOs and think tanks. That was not acceptable to some states. Some proposals were to have experts involved in the discussions of the NPT at the same level as states, that they should make interventions, they should give briefings to the states, they should examine the reports provided by NPT states parties. So that also didn't fly. So in the end, the working group basically failed, and it ended on a bad atmosphere. But then we start the PrepCom, which starts on the following Monday, on the 31st of July. And for the first, I would say, week, atmosphere was reasonably good. There was some political point scoring in terms of the relations between the three great powers, China, Russia, United States. There were a lot of statements, mainly from the EU countries, on the safety and security of nuclear power plants in conflict zones, especially the situation regarding the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. There were also some very strange statements on NATO nuclear sharing or extended deterrence, because US nuclear weapons are deployed in 5 NATO non-nuclear weapon states, and that's Belgium, Turkey, Netherlands, Italy, and Germany. And one of these states made a statement that NATO nuclear sharing is perfectly acceptable. It is seamlessly integrated into the NPT, and so on. So this was, I think, rather provocative. But the main difference was that the 5 nuclear weapon states and the NPT, that's China, France, UK, Russia, United States, they were not prepared to accept any timelines, any targets, or any benchmarks on further progress on nuclear disarmament. So I'll stop there, and we can continue with your next question.
Yes, so atmosphere was really intense, as you mentioned. So, Mr. Rauf, the agenda also comprises many challenges. Maybe you already mentioned several, but could you just dwell upon major ones between great powers, nuclear, non-nuclear states?
So the agenda is the standard agenda, which gets repeated every time from the preparatory committee to the review conference. So the work of a preparatory committee and the review conference is divided into so-called 3 pillars. Pillar 1 deals with nuclear disarmament. Pillar 2 deals with non-proliferation. In other words, IAEA safeguards or verification by International Atomic Energy Agency in non-nuclear weapon states, export controls, and nuclear security, security of facilities and materials. And Pillar 3 deals with peaceful uses of nuclear energy. That is using nuclear energy for generation of electricity, healthcare, in animals and water. And so there are many, many peaceful uses of nuclear energy besides generating electricity. And then there are also regional issues. And under regional issues comes the nuclear program of North Korea, also nuclear programs of India, Pakistan, and also establishment of a zone free of nuclear weapons in the Middle East. And then there are a couple of other issues. One is withdrawal. The NPT, like any international security treaty, provides for a country to leave the treaty. So the only country that has withdrawn from the NPT is North Korea, which did so in January 2003. So countries, the Western countries, want to make it more difficult for a country in the future to withdraw from the NPT. And here, of course, while they don't mention it by name, their target is Iran. Given the continuing Iran nuclear file and the failure of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action since the United States under the Trump administration withdrew from it in May 2018, and even though the IAEA had been reporting that Iran was living up to the obligations under the JCPOA. So as usual, the biggest area of differences was on nuclear disarmament. So at one level, pretty much all non-nuclear weapon states, including members of NATO, South Korea, Japan, and Australia, which are also covered under U.S. defense arrangements. They all talked about more nuclear disarmament. There was also a lot of discussion on reporting. So starting in 2000, at the 2000 review conference, it was agreed that all states would submit a report on their implementation of the NPT, but the 5 nuclear weapon states would submit special reports because they have the privilege of having nuclear weapons. And then the non-nuclear weapon states want to have a common reporting format for all 5 nuclear weapon states to follow. For example, how many nuclear weapons they have, how many nuclear weapons are on alert status, how many nuclear weapons have been dismantled, how much nuclear material they have for weapons, that is highly enriched uranium and plutonium, and so on. And the nuclear weapon states are prepared to report, but at different levels. So traditionally, the United States provides the most detailed reports. The United Kingdom and France provide reports that are a little bit less detailed. China provides reports that have very little information. Russian Federation provides reports that are more than the Chinese, more information than the Chinese, but much less than the information provided by the United States. So the Russian position is that under Russian legislation, this type of information is subject to national classification and cannot be released to the public. And while the Russian Federation and United States exchange data under the New START Treaty, some of that information cannot be made public, according to the Russian Federation. And the Chinese position is that the biggest possessors of nuclear weapons are United States and Russia. So they have somewhere around 6,000 each. And China claims to have somewhere around 300, 400, 500, we don't know. And so Chinese position is when the 2 big nuclear countries reduce nuclear weapons to the level of China, then China will report. So there was no progress on breaking this, and the nuclear weapon states in different ways resisted providing greater accountability. They also resisted new benchmarks as to what specifically they should do. They also resisted any timeline that by, let's say, 2026, you should do X, Y, or Z. So this was an important issue that on which there was no agreement. But the issue of nuclear safety and security of nuclear power plants, especially Zaporizhia, was also a very politically intense discussion. So the Russian Federation was unwilling to accept any references to the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant that contained language that, in the view of the Russian Federation, was not factual. And from the Western side, they wanted language that was more critical of the Russian control of the Zaporizhia power plant and the situation regarding the war in Ukraine. So on this issue, there was not going to be any meeting of minds. They're very different positions. China was very concerned about AUKUS, which is the agreement announced in September 2021 between the United Kingdom, United States, and Australia, where Australia would be provided a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines by over the next 20 years or so. So China regards this as a threat, and also something that I have worked on since 1987-88, when Canada was the first non-nuclear weapon state that was looking to acquire nuclear submarines. And under the Safeguards Agreement for non-nuclear weapon states, there is a provision where for non-proscribed military activity, which is military activity not connected with nuclear weapons, a non-nuclear weapon state can remove from IAEA verification nuclear material. So in the case of the US submarines to be provided to Australia, somewhere around 2,000 metric tons of weapon-grade highly enriched uranium, up to 97%, would be exempted from safeguards. So this is a big problem for the IAEA as well. And then another controversial issue was the discharge of water from the Fukushima nuclear power plant. So there are many millions of liters of water contaminated as the water leaks through from an underground spring through the 4 destroyed reactors. It becomes radioactive. So the Japanese have come up with a scheme for what they call treating the water, removing the radioactive isotopes, and then discharging it into the ocean. But a small amount of tritium will remain in that water. So the Japanese call it treated water. The China and some others call it contaminated water. And there is a lot of public opposition among fisher people in Japan, South Korea, and others about the discharge of this water. So this was also a problematic issue. And then for the Arab states, as usual, they push for language on a Middle East nuclear weapon-free zone. This is a resolution from the 1995 NPT conference. The co-sponsors of this resolution are UK, Russia, and the United States. The Arab states want pressure to be put on Israel to give up its nuclear capability and join the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state. So then another point of contention was IAEA safeguards and additional protocol. So even in the IAEA Board of Governors, the additional protocol to safeguards agreement has not been made mandatory. It is voluntary. But the Western group uses language that an additional protocol is required for a non-nuclear weapon state party to the NPT. So there was also pushback on this. And there were some other issues. So when the chair, so for the first session and second session of the PrepCom, the responsibility of the chair is only to produce a factual summary of what was discussed. And so the chair produced a factual summary of 122 paragraphs. And so there was a lot of disagreement. Some countries, many countries were not satisfied for different reasons. So the chair then produced a revised version of the draft factual summary. But we also have a new team supporting the NPT Secretariat from the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs. And also at the IAEA, there is a new team that supports the NPT Secretariat. So between them, in my view, they could have done a better job in helping the chair produce a draft factual summary. And my last comment on this before we move to the next question is that in the very first sentence of the draft factual summary, a problem was created because the normal language is that the Non-Proliferation Treaty is the cornerstone of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. But in the factual summary, it talked about cornerstone of non-proliferation first. So many countries were very unhappy. And so that set the tone that this report was not a balanced report. Iran was not prepared to accept any references to it under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that in Iran's view was critical of Iran. Similarly, Syria also opposed language on its previous activities that Syria thought was unfair. So the way the report was structured, it was clear that there would not be any agreement.
Well, thanks. Very interesting peculiarities, even minor language matters in such formats. I wanted to start with the end. So you touched upon additional protocol, saying that it's voluntarily. But could you please dwell upon it more? Why the Western group wants to make it obligatory, please, if you don't.
So under the NPT, Article 3.1, the responsibility for verification of non-nuclear weapon states' nuclear activities is assigned to the IAEA. And the obligation is that in a non-nuclear weapon state, all nuclear activities must be for peaceful purposes and not for any purpose related to nuclear weapons. And the NPT does not describe how the verification is to be done. It gives it to the IAEA. Now, this is very different from the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Both of those treaties, in the treaty itself, contains all the details of verification. So chemical weapons and CTBT, if you look at their text, they go into many, many pages and many articles of verification. The NPT has only 10 articles. And so the IAEA then devised the verification system for non-nuclear weapon states in 1970 to 72. And after the Iraq's clandestine nuclear program was discovered in 1991, it showed that the traditional IAEA safeguard system had some weaknesses. So IAEA needed to ensure that a state's declaration to the IAEA was not only correct, but also complete. And to verify this, the IAEA needed additional tools over and above the traditional safeguards agreement. And so that is why the additional protocol was adopted by the Board of Governors in 1997. So the legal obligation remains the same from the NPT and the safeguards agreement, but the additional protocol gives the IAEA additional tools such as environmental sampling, early provision of design information of nuclear facilities, long-term visas for IAEA inspectors. The IAEA now looks to the state's activities as a whole, rather than looking only at specific nuclear facilities and so on. But in the Board of Governors in 1997, the board could not agree that the additional protocol should be a requirement for non-nuclear weapon states. So it was left as mandatory. And so for particularly the Arab states and Brazil, they argue that under the NPT, only the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement is required. And we have it, and therefore we don't need the additional protocol. And so for the Arab countries, they want to use this as leverage against the United States and the West to put pressure on Israel to join the NPT and have the zone free of nuclear weapons in the Middle East. So the Western countries have a compromise solution, which is that those non-nuclear weapon states that have an additional protocol, for them, this is the current verification standard. But they want this language to be for everyone. And so they cannot get it at the IAEA, so they try it in the NPT and they fail. So this is, again, unwise and useless way of proceeding because the countries are the same. You have Brazil and Arab countries in the IAEA who reject the additional protocol. So if they reject it in the IAEA, why would they accept it in the NPT format? So here you question the motives of countries who deliberately try to create roadblocks. And so this is one example. And I'm coming to the conclusion now that to some extent the European Union and the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Initiative have become too active in the NPT review process, and the non-aligned group has become more disorganized. And they are unable to come up with a good unified position. The Western countries meet pretty much every day in the morning to coordinate their position before the meeting starts. The non-aligned didn't even hold their first coordination meeting until the middle of the first week of the PrepCom, which is the middle of the second week because we already had the working group. So you had a lack of coordination, and therefore the chair of the PrepCom is under undue pressure because a lot of the talking and a lot of the working papers come from the Non-Proliferation Disarmament Initiative and the European Union, and therefore the chair is forced to include more of that language. And when you include more of that language, then there is pushback from the non-aligned, from China, from Russia, and so on.
Interesting. And one more question I wanted to ask. You already mentioned Brazil and AUKUS, and so now it is one of the new challenges related to AUKUS and naval nuclear propulsion mechanism. could you please tell us? So there are two precedents now of non-nuclear weapon states which are on the path of acquiring submarines. It is Brazil and Australia. So, what is how it is related to NPT? What is a gray zone? And do you think that it could become like a prerequisite for further proliferation of nuclear submarines?
So you're right. So under paragraph 14 or article 14 of the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, which is information circular number 153, which anyone can download from the IAEA website. In article 14, it provides for non-proscribed military activity, which means a military activity not connected with nuclear weapons. So this could be a nuclear-powered submarine. It could also be a power source for a satellite or a rocket to be sent into space. So if, for example, if one was sending a satellite to Mars, you need the satellite to have a power source. And so for that, you could put a nuclear power source. But the difference is that once the satellite goes into space, it's not coming back to Earth. Whereas a submarine comes back to port. So as I mentioned, the Australians were the first one to announce this program in September 2021. But Brazil, for a long time, has had a nuclear submarine acquisition program, and they have used this to justify the Brazilian program for enrichment of uranium. And so they say, yeah, we are enriching uranium because we want to have a nuclear submarine. And so once the Australians, the British, and the Americans under AUKUS opened the door in September 2021, in March 2022, Brazil also announced to the IAEA that we are also. But the difference is that the Brazilian nuclear submarine program is an indigenous program developed by Brazil itself. And it uses low enriched uranium, that is uranium enriched below 20%. And also, Brazil has a unique safeguards arrangement with Argentina. And then there is a bilateral organization called ABAC, Argentinian Brazilian Agency for Accounting and Control. And we have a safeguards agreement between four parties: IAEA, Argentine Brazilian Agency for Accounting and Control, Argentina, and Brazil, called ABAC. And under this agreement, naval nuclear propulsion is described as a peaceful nuclear activity. They don't describe it as a non-proscribed military activity. And so under their agreement, there would need to be special procedures for a country like Brazil to have a nuclear submarine program, of inviting ABAC and IAEA to do verification, but also for protection of military classified information, because a submarine is still a naval vessel. So those details are in the process of being discussed with the IAEA, but not in public. In the case of Australia, its submarines, when it gets them, will have weapon-grade, highly enriched uranium. Plus, Australia is importing a nuclear reactor in the submarine, and they're importing the nuclear highly enriched uranium. So this puts it in a different category. And so also the three countries are not being very transparent in providing information on how this uranium will be dealt with. So the IAEA has a difficult problem on its hands. So people like me, we have been arguing that a special committee of experts should be set up to define what is the meaning of non-proscribed military activity. What is the meaning of non-application of safeguards? When Canada was getting submarines in 1987-88, which eventually Canada canceled, I wrote to the IAEA and I published in my paper, which is available on the web, a letter from the IAEA which says we have no definition of what is non-proscribed military activity. We have no definition of what is non-application of safeguards. And in the opinion of the IAEA in 1988, Article 14 does not include and it does not exclude naval nuclear propulsion. So we have an issue that the three countries, Australia, UK, and United States, have unilaterally taken upon themselves the responsibility to define for everyone else how naval nuclear propulsion will be done for a non-nuclear weapon state. And they want to put a fait accompli before the Board of Governors. By then, it will be too late to make any changes. So that's the real issue. The Western countries, of course, politically are supporting the US, the UK, and Australia, and they say, fine, we trust these three countries to set a high non-proliferation standard, and whatever they bring before the board, we trust them will be very good. China and others say, well, we don't know, and we want to have a say because this applies to every country, and we need to have a standard template so that whether it's Brazil, whether it's Australia, whether in the future it might be South Korea, it might be Japan, or some other NPT non-nuclear weapon state, could be Iran, we have the same standard. So IAEA verification is credible only when the same standard is applied to every state and we do not have different standards.
Thank you so much. I think you've touched a lot of topics, everything, and I am grateful to you of how you can make, how can you deliver those difficult things in such a wonderful and simple way. Thanks for your time. It was very nice discussion. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much, and I wish you and Peace Center all the best, and keep doing your work and supporting international peace and security.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay.